I was promoted at my job and started earning double what my husband made, so I divorced him because I no longer needed a man. It's been 3 months and he looks very happy instead of begging me to come back. Did I matter that little to him? You have to understand that in the world of high finance and corporate leadership, everything is about trajectory. When Julian and I first met 5 years ago, we were on relatively similar planes. Or at least it seemed that way to my younger, less experienced self. I was an ambitious associate and he was a graphic designer with a creative spark that I found charming at the time. We built a life together, or what I thought was a life, but looking back I realized I was simply subsidizing a lifestyle that he didn't have the drive to maintain on his own. Our marriage was like a project that had a decent initial public offering, but eventually plateaued because one of the partners refused to innovate. I spent years pushing myself, networking until my voice went hoarse and strategically climbing the ladder while he was content playing with fonts. The turning point was the Tuesday I walked into the boardroom and was handed my new contract as senior director. The numbers were beautiful. A base salary of $210,000 plus performance bonuses and a stock option package that finally put me in the league I belonged in. I remember holding that pen, feeling the weight of the gold nib, and realizing that my entire world had just shifted on its axis. I wasn't just Victoria anymore. I was a high-yield asset. When I got home that evening, the aesthetic disharmony of our apartment hit me like a physical blow. Julian was sitting on our mid-range sofa, probably thinking about what color to make a logo, and I felt a wave of genuine pity for him. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fundamental gap in our market value that had become an unbridgeable chasm. I had plans to lease a Porsche Taycan, a vehicle that requires a certain level of maintenance and status that Julian's stagnant $85,000 salary couldn't even begin to comprehend. Why should I be the one constantly providing the premium fuel for a relationship that was clearly running on a low-grade economy engine? I realized that coming home to him was like trying to park a luxury yacht in a shallow, muddy pond. I deserved a partner who reflected my success, not a dependent who reminded me of the lower-tier version of myself I had worked so hard to outrun. I decided to handle the situation with the same executive decisiveness that got me my promotion. I made a reservation at the most exclusive restaurant in the city, a place where the tasting menu alone costs more than Julian's monthly car payment. Throughout the $400 dinner, which I naturally paid for because I refused to let an inferior account settle the bill, I watched him. He was talking about some mundane project at his studio, completely oblivious to the fact that he was being audited. I looked at his hands, his clothes, and his simple way of speaking, and I knew I couldn't do it for another day. I didn't want a husband in the traditional sentimental sense. I wanted an equal, and he was dead weight in my new tax bracket. When the dessert arrived, I didn't mince words because efficiency is key in any restructuring process. I calmly explained to him that our growth trajectories were no longer compatible and that it was time to dissolve the partnership. I told him quite clearly that I was cleaning my assets of anything that didn't yield a high return on investment, and he was, unfortunately, a depreciating factor. I watched his face, expecting tears, a plea, or perhaps a desperate promise to work harder to keep up with me. Instead, he just sat there, looking at me with a blank, hollow expression that I interpreted as shock from being confronted with his own inadequacy. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the business card of my high-end divorce attorney, a man who specializes in protecting the wealth of people like me. I slid it across the table along with the check for the dinner, a final gesture of charity to ensure he wouldn't struggle with the immediate costs. He didn't even argue or try to defend his lack of ambition, which only proved my point about his low-energy nature. He just took the card, stood up, and walked out of the restaurant without saying a single word. I sat there for a moment, sipping the remainder of my vintage wine, feeling a profound sense of empowerment. The following days were a whirlwind of productivity as I began the process of clearing the books. I felt lighter, as if I had finally shed a heavy winter coat in the middle of a scorching summer. My friends, the real ones who understand the pressures of the six-figure lifestyle, congratulated me on my upgrade. They agreed that a woman of my caliber shouldn't be held back by someone who is content with subsistence living. Julian moved out within the week, taking only his personal items and leaving the furniture I had mostly paid for anyway. I didn't care where he went. I was too busy looking at penthouse floor plans. I spent the first weekend of my new life as a single senior director touring luxury showrooms and picking out pieces that actually matched my aura. Everything in my life needed to be curated, from the art on the walls to the person in my bed, and Julian was a relic of a past I had outgrown. I viewed the divorce not as a failure but as a necessary corporate spin-off to allow the parent company me to thrive. There was a certain thrill in knowing that I was finally free to pursue a high-value lifestyle without having to explain it to someone who thought a $50 bottle of wine was a splurge. The paperwork was moving along smoothly because my attorney is a shark who knows how to handle minor obstacles like Julian. I felt like I was finally winning at the game of life, standing at the summit and looking down at the people who were too afraid to climb. I expected to feel some level of grief, but all I felt was a clinical sense of satisfaction at a job well done. I had optimized my existence, removing the sentimental clutter that clogs the gears of progress. Julian was just a footnote in a very successful quarterly report. However, as the weeks passed, I noticed a strange lack of feedback from the market. I expected Julian to be calling, texting, or begging for a second chance once he realized what he had lost. I figured he'd be struggling to make ends meet in some dingy apartment, realizing that his $85,000 was nothing without my support. But my phone remained silent, and my social media tags were empty of his desperate attempts to reconnect. It was almost as if he didn't realize that his CEO had just fired him, and his lack of reaction was starting to feel like a personal insult to my brand. Main story comments. Anonymous user 1 says, so you're telling me that 5 years of marriage through thick and thin were worth less to you than a title change on LinkedIn? You sound like you're describing a used car, not a human being you supposedly love. Oops, reply love is a romanticized term for a mutual exchange of value. If one party stops bringing value to the table, the contract is naturally terminated. It's just basic logic that some people are too emotional to understand. Anonymous user 2 says, in what world is $85,000 poor? Most people would kill for that salary. Yet you talk about him like he's a beggar on the street because you hit a lucky streak. Ops reply, lucky streak? I worked for every cent, and in the circles I move in, anything under 6 figures is essentially subsistence living. I can't be expected to lower my standards for the sake of his comfort. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and I've successfully moved into a penthouse that finally reflects the level of prestige I've attained. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer a view of the city that reminds me every morning that I am above the common fray. However, I found myself somewhat preoccupied with the logistical details of Julian's new diminished life. I discovered he moved into a small loft in a district that people call trendy, but is clearly just a euphemism for affordable for the lower middle class. I found myself driving by his new building in my Taycan, purely out of a professional curiosity to see if he looked as miserable as he should. I expected to see him struggling with boxes, looking haggard and overwhelmed by the reality of living without my financial cushion. Instead, I saw him standing on the sidewalk with a couple of movers, and he was actually laughing. He was holding a cheap canned beer, the kind of swill I haven't touched since college, and he looked lighter, in a way that didn't make any sense. It was probably a coping mechanism, a desperate attempt to pretend that he wasn't mourning the loss of the premium life I had provided. People often use forced humor to mask the deep-seated trauma of a significant downgrade. To ensure he understood the disparity between our new realities, I posted a high-resolution photo of my new Cartier watch against the leather interior of my Porsche. I captioned it, upgrades only, making sure the lighting was perfect so the diamonds would catch the eye of anyone scrolling. I know for a fact he still follows me, so I waited for the notification, the like, or the inevitable "I'm sorry" DM. But hours turned into days and he hasn't even acknowledged the post. It's a calculated insult to my market value, a form of passive-aggressive silence that is beneath someone of my stature. I find it incredibly irritating that he thinks he can just exist happily in a loft while I am here, achieving everything we once talked about. Does he not realize that I was the one who provided the momentum for our entire social life? Without me, he's just a guy with a sketchbook and a stagnant bank account. The fact that he isn't calling me at 2 a.m. to cry about how much he misses my guidance is proof of how delusional he has become. He's probably just trying to save face, pretending that he's okay with his new mediocre existence. My new colleagues at the firm all agree that I made the right choice, pointing out that dead weight only drags you down during a high-speed ascent. We spend our lunches discussing investment strategies and the best places to buy property in the Hamptons. It's refreshing to be around people who speak my language, people who don't think a $200 brunch is an extravagance. Yet, during the quiet moments in my penthouse, I find myself checking his profile more often than I'd like to admit. I'm just looking for the cracks in his facade, the inevitable moment when the freedom of being poor loses its luster. I've started dating a bit, mostly networking with men who have similar portfolios to mine. It's efficient, but I find myself comparing their closing styles to the way I ended things with Julian. I was so clean, so professional, and he should be grateful I didn't make the divorce a messy public affair. I gave him a dignified exit from a league he never truly belonged in. The fact that he isn't acknowledging that grace is a sign of his fundamental lack of class. I've also noticed that some of our mutual friends have stopped inviting me to things, which is fine, because I don't have time for people who can't handle my success. They're probably taking his side because they relate more to his average lifestyle than to my high-performance one. It's a classic case of the crabs in a bucket mentality, where they try to pull down anyone who manages to climb out. I don't need them. I have a title and a salary that says I'm better than their Sunday barbecues. The silence from Julian is starting to feel like a loud, persistent noise in the back of my mind. I even considered sending him a check-in text, perhaps offering him some advice on how to manage his meager budget now that he's on his own. But I decided against it. A queen doesn't look back at the peasant she left at the crossroads. I have a legacy to build, and he's just a ghost in a cheaper zip code. If he wants to pretend he's happy with canned beer and a loft, that's his delusion to live with. I am focused on my ROI now, and my personal life is just another column on my spreadsheet. I've scheduled a meeting with a wealth manager to ensure that none of my new income can be touched by Julian during the final settlement. It's not that I'm being petty, as some of the uninspired people online might say. I'm being protective of my brand and the hard work I've put into becoming the woman I am today. Julian was a liability, and I've successfully liquidated him from my life. Still, every time I see a graphic designer or someone wearing the kind of casual clothes he liked, I feel a pang of annoyance. It's not that I miss him, it's that I'm offended by the idea that someone could be so satisfied with so little. It challenges my entire worldview, the one that says more is always better, and status is the only metric that matters. He should be miserable, and the fact that he isn't is a glitch in the system I refuse to ignore. Update 1 comments. Anonymous user 1 says you drove by his house in your new car just to see if he was crying? That's not verifying depreciation, Victoria. That's called being a stalker. You're obsessed with a man you claim is beneath you. Ops reply, I wasn't stalking. I was performing a routine audit of the situation to ensure the transition was proceeding as expected. It's called due diligence, something you clearly wouldn't understand from your armchair. Anonymous user 2 says maybe he's laughing because the stress of living with someone who treats marriage like a hostile takeover is finally gone. Have you considered that he's actually happier without you? Ops reply, that's absurd. I was the premium fuel in that relationship without me. He's just stalling on the side of the road. He's clearly just in the denial phase of his inevitable collapse. Update 2. It's been 1 month since my last update, and we finally had to meet in person to finalize the division of our minor assets. I decided to treat this like a high-stakes negotiation, wearing a $3,000 tailored suit that screams authority and success. I wanted to make sure that when Julian looked at me, he saw exactly what he no longer had access to. A woman of power, elegance, and immense market value. I even had my assistant call me 3 times during the first 10 minutes just to emphasize how busy and important my new life has become. Julian showed up in a plain, well-fitted t-shirt and jeans, looking like he'd been spending more time at the gym than at a desk. He looked incredibly relaxed, too. Relaxed for a man whose life I had just dismantled with surgical precision. I spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting complaining about the low quality of the administrative assistants I've been assigned at my new level of management. I expected him to nod along to validate how difficult it is to find people who can keep up with a high-performance individual like myself. Instead, he just leaned back in his chair with a faint, almost pitying smile and said, I'm sure you'll find someone to yell at soon, Victoria. The arrogance of that comment coming from a man who probably still uses a generic calendar app was staggering. When the lawyer brought out the final papers, I made a show of throwing an alimony waiver in his face. I called it a mercy gesture, a way to ensure he wouldn't have to deal with the humiliation of receiving charity from a woman who earns more than double his salary. I expected him to fight for at least a small settlement, to try and claw back some of the wealth I've generated. But he didn't even review the document. He just signed it with a steady hand and pushed it back toward me. He didn't want a single cent of my hard-earned money, which I found deeply suspicious. It's almost as if he was trying to prove some sort of moral point, as if his peace of mind was more valuable than the financial security I was offering. That kind of low ambition thinking is exactly why I had to leave him in the first place. He's so uninspired that he can't even recognize a good deal when it's shoved in his face. I told him he was being foolish, that he should take the money and invest it in his little projects, but he just looked at me and said, "I'm good, Victoria. Truly." I felt like I was speaking a language he had suddenly forgotten, or perhaps one he had never really understood. The rest of the meeting was equally frustrating because he refused to engage in the emotional chaos I expected. I tried to bring up some of the things he'd done wrong during our marriage, the ways he'd failed to support my ascent, but he just tuned it out. He acted as if I were a stranger he was doing a quick business transaction with, rather than the woman who had been the center of his world for half a decade. His lack of investment in our shared history was a slap in the face to my legacy. I built that marriage, and he was treating it like a closed file. After the meeting, I watched him walk to his car, a modest, practical thing that didn't have leather seats. He didn't look back once, not even a glance toward the woman in the $3,000 suit who had just graciously let him go. I stood there on the sidewalk, feeling like I had won the battle but somehow lost the audience. I have the penthouse, the car, the title, and the salary, but the person who was supposed to be impressed by it all seemed to have moved on to a different market entirely. It's incredibly ungrateful of him to not even show a hint of regret. I went back to my office and tried to focus on a multi-million-dollar merger, but I kept thinking about his smile. It wasn't a coping smile, it was the smile of someone who had just walked out of a prison. The idea that he could view our life together as a sentence is a gross distortion of the facts. I provided him with everything: status, stability, and a front-row seat to my success. If he felt trapped, it was only by his own inability to scale his life to match mine. My attorney told me I should be happy that it was so easy that most men in his position would have tried to take me for everything I'm worth. He called it a clean break and congratulated me on my superior negotiating position. But it doesn't feel clean, it feels unfinished. A proper conclusion requires the other party to admit defeat, to acknowledge that they are worse off without you. Julian is acting like he's just had a successful divestment, and it's making me question the yield of the entire relationship. I've started staying later at the office, filling the silence of my penthouse with spreadsheets and conference calls. It's more productive this way, and I don't have to deal with the unstructured time that Julian used to fill with his nonsense. But sometimes I find myself looking at the spot on the wall where one of his mediocre paintings used to hang. I'm not sentimental, of course. I'm just assessing the negative space and how to fill it with something more high value. Maybe a piece of modern art that actually has an investment future. Julian is a fool for not taking the money, and he'll realize it eventually when he's struggling to pay for his trendy loft. I was being charitable, a former superior looking out for a subordinate of my life, and he threw it back in my face. His pride is going to be his downfall, and I'll be here at the top, watching him sink. He's just a low-ambition individual who doesn't understand the cost of doing business. I'm a senior director, and I don't have time for people who don't respect the bottom line. Update 2 comments. Anonymous user 1 says he didn't take the money because he knows it comes with strings attached to your ego. He'd rather be poor and free than take a mercy check from someone who thinks they're his boss. Ops reply, that's just a low ambition way of looking at a smart financial move. He's too proud to admit he needs me, and that kind of ego is exactly why he'll never scale his life. Anonymous user 2 says calling an alimony waiver a mercy gesture is the most condescending thing I've ever heard. You're not his superior, you're just his ex-wife with a bigger ego than a bank account. Ops reply, in any organization, there is a hierarchy. Our marriage was no different. I was the one driving the growth, and he was a legacy employee who was no longer meeting the KPIs. Update 3. It's been 2 months since my last update, and the silence from Julian's end was finally broken. Not by him, but by a mutual friend. I heard through the grapevine that Julian has started a small boutique agency, some sort of creative consultancy for local businesses. It sounded so small-time, so local, that I actually laughed when I heard it. I decided to send him a professional email from my corporate account, offering to mentor him or connect him with some of my high-level global clients. I phrased it as a gesture of industry solidarity, but we both know it was me asserting that I am still the one with the actual power. I waited for his reply, imagining his gratitude or perhaps his awkward attempt to decline while still acknowledging my superiority. Instead, he replied with a brief, dismissive message. "No thanks, Victoria. I'm actually turning down clients so I can enjoy my weekends. Something I haven't done in years." But the sheer audacity of that statement left me fuming for hours. He's choosing free time over scaling a business. It's so mediocre, so fundamentally un-American that it literally makes me sick to my stomach. Who turns down growth for weekends? I find myself checking his Instagram every night now, purely to monitor the competition and ensure he isn't using my name or connections to build his little boutique. What I see is infuriating. He's hiking, he's painting in a park, he's smiling. There are no photos of hustle, no late-night office shots, just pictures of him looking disgustingly relaxed. My life, by contrast, is 80 hours of high-stakes meetings and expensive salads eaten alone at my desk while I review quarterly projections. I am the one with the success, yet he is the one who looks like he's actually living. It's a glitch in the logic I've built my entire life on, and it's starting to wear me down. I'm achieving every goal I've ever set, my ROI is through the roof, and yet I feel like I'm in a constant state of war while he's in a state of leisure. He should be the one stressed, the one trying to prove himself after the failure of our marriage. But he's acting as if the divorce was the best career move he ever made, as if I were the burden he had to shed to finally find his market fit. It's a total reversal of the facts as I know them. I tried to talk to my new networking partner about it, a man who is also a director at a major firm, but he just wanted to talk about synergy and market disruption. Our entire date was basically a series of transactions and ego stroking. I realized that everyone in my current circle is exactly like me, obsessed with the yield and the image. We don't have weekends. We have strategic rest periods to ensure we can keep performing at a high level. Julian's free time feels like a direct attack on my entire philosophy of existence. I've started feeling a strange sense of isolation in my penthouse, despite the high-value furniture and the view of the city. Everything I own is a trophy, but there's no one there to see them who isn't trying to take them away from me. Julian used to listen to me, really listen, without trying to poach my ideas or disrupt my flow. But he was deadweight. I keep telling myself, he didn't have the trajectory. I needed to surround myself with winners, and winners are by definition competitive and transactional. I find myself obsessing over his mediocre weekends, wondering what he could possibly find so satisfying about a hike or a painting. Doesn't he realize that leisure is for people who have given up on being great? I am great. I have the title and the salary to prove it. Yet, the 80 hours of meetings are starting to feel like a heavy golden chain. I'm the senior director, but I'm also the only one who has to be available 24/7 to justify my cost. I considered sending him another email, perhaps a more aggressive one, pointing out that his lack of ambition is why he'll always be a boutique player. But I realized that would make me look invested in his life, and I'm supposed to be divested. I'm just monitoring him to ensure there's no brand damage. That's what I tell myself every night when I scroll through his photos of street food and local galleries. He's living a low-resolution life, and I shouldn't care. Yet, the high-resolution life I've built feels increasingly like a series of empty frames. I have the best of everything, but the best people are all exhausting. They all want something. They all have an agenda, and none of them would ever just sit with me and drink a cheap beer without talking about market share. I'm at the top of the mountain, but the air is incredibly thin, and I'm starting to realize that the person I left at the base is the only one who didn't want to push me off. I am not unhappy. Of course, I'm just optimizing my emotional state. Success is a demanding mistress, and I am her most devoted servant. If Julian wants to settle for weekends and local clients, that's his choice. I am building an empire, even if I have to eat every victory meal alone in a room full of expensive things. He is the one who lost the queen, and I am the one who gained the world. So why does it feel like I'm the one who is actually stalling? Update 3 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, leisure is for the uninspired. No, Victoria. Leisure is for people who actually have a life. You have a LinkedIn profile, not a life. Julian won the divorce the second he stopped caring about your market value. Oops, reply, my LinkedIn profile, as you call it, is a testament to my power and influence. Leisure is just a fancy word for unproductive time, and I refuse to be unproductive. Anonymous user 2 says, why are you still monitoring him every night? If he's so mediocre, why does his low-resolution life bother you so much? You're obsessed with the man you claimed was deadweight. Ops reply, I am simply monitoring the competition to ensure he isn't leveraging my professional reputation for his boutique nonsense. It's called brand protection, and it's a standard business practice. Update 4. It's been 3 months since my last update, and the reality I've worked so hard to curate finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. Today, I saw a photo of Julian at a local gallery opening, and he wasn't alone. He was with a woman who looked average. She wasn't wearing a designer suit or carrying a $5,000 bag. She was wearing a simple dress and had a genuine, unforced laugh. I found out she's a school teacher, a woman whose annual yield is probably what I make in a month. They were standing by a food truck, laughing over street tacos for God's sake, and they looked more connected than I have ever felt with anyone in my high-value circles. I was sitting in a Michelin star restaurant at the time, having dinner with a networking contact who I thought was a potential partner. But as the night went on, I realized he spent the entire time trying to subtly poach my clients and disrupt my firm's influence. Every word out of his mouth was a transaction. Every compliment was a maneuver, and I was doing the exact same thing to him. I looked at my $100 plate of artfully arranged vegetables and felt a sudden sickening wave of clarity. I have achieved everything I set out to do, and I am the most miserable person in the room. I divorced Julian because I thought he wasn't high value enough for my new life, but I've realized that my new life is just a series of cold exchanges with people who don't actually like me. I measured his worth in annual yield and growth trajectory, completely ignoring the fact that he was the only person who saw me as something more than a senior director. I treated our marriage like a failed startup that I needed to clean from my portfolio, but in doing so, I threw away the only asset that had any actual human value. Julian didn't lose a queen. He shed a burden that was constantly demanding. He'd be someone he's not. He's happy because he's finally free from the person who quantified his soul in a spreadsheet. He's eating street tacos with a woman who probably thinks his boutique agency is impressive because of the passion he puts into it, not the profit margin. I have the penthouse, the Cartier watch, and the Porsche Taycan, but I'm the only one in this divorce who is actually poor. My life is a collection of expensive things and empty synergies, while his life is full of weekends, painting, and people who laugh without an agenda. I spent months calling him deadweight and mediocre, but the truth is that he was the anchor that kept me from drifting into this cold corporate void. I thought I was upgrading, but I was really just trading depth for surface area. I'm a senior director at a firm where everyone is waiting for me to slip so they can take my office. I have double the salary, but I have 0 people. I can call at 2 a.m. who won't charge me a consultancy fee or use the information against me. I realized that Julian's refusal of the alimony and his dismissal of my mentorship weren't acts of pride. They were acts of delisting himself from my toxic market. He didn't want my money because he didn't want any part of the deal I represent. He's turning down clients because he understands something I've completely forgotten, that time is a non-renewable resource, and spending it on scaling a life you don't enjoy is the worst investment of all. I am the winner on paper, but I'm losing the only game that actually matters. I looked at that photo of them one last time before I closed my phone and walked out of the restaurant, leaving my networking contact with the bill. I drove my luxury car back to my empty penthouse, the city lights looking like cold, distant diamonds that I can never quite reach. I sat on my expensive sofa, the one that perfectly matches my aura, and I realized that I am surrounded by high-value ghosts. I am the senior director of an empty empire, and the peasant I left behind is the one who is truly living like a king. I won't be sending any more emails or monitoring his Instagram anymore. There's no point in auditing a life that is no longer in my jurisdiction, especially when that life is so clearly superior to mine in every way that counts. I have my raw, my market value, and my upgrades, and I have to live with the fact that I traded a human soul for a higher tax bracket. I am finally at the top of the mountain just like I wanted, and the view is absolutely terrifyingly hollow. I'm the woman who has everything, and yet I have absolutely nothing. Julian is free, and I am the one who is truly stalled, trapped in a high-performance engine with nowhere left to go. I made my choice. I cleaned my assets, and now I have to sit in the pristine silence of my success. I mattered so little to him in the end because I had become a transaction he no longer wanted to fund. And the worst part is, I can't even fire him for it. He already quit.